All right. Should we go into 13 and possibly 14 in one go, in one episode?
I think we can do both in one episode. Starts the episode, and they're like, "Man, they already look forward. I'm going to watch something else."
Well, to the
We're both
viewers,
very
I
tired.
can say that I am fasting and I'm on my day 3 water fast, just nothing but water. So my energy may appear low. Bear with me. So I just speak a lot softer when I'm fasting.
I may join you on the fast sometime this week,
Oh, yeah?
maybe 3 to 5 days.
All right, let's jump in to read chapter 13. That should be the screen.
You got it.
I got it. It's on the screen so
All
we can
right.
start reading.
So last where we left off, God spoke to Abram and sent him out of Ur, or as we discussed, possibly Urfa, um, and down towards Canaan, where the Canaanites live. And he set up tent there. And there was a famine, and so he left and went to Egypt and had a whole bunch of problems in Egypt, where his wife was
Where we
things
thoroughly
happened with his
disagreed.
wife. Yeah, where things happened with his wife, either because he's a terrible person, because he disobeys God, or a little bit of both. Um, and then ends up coming back out of Egypt, sent out of Egypt with a bunch of stuff, and
Yeah,
back
he got
towards
very
Canaan.
wealthy after pimping his wife. That's my take.
It's funny because we'll see a very similar pattern coming up in a couple chapters, not in this chapter. But
Oh,
one
I
thing I
can't
didn't
I
really
can't
discuss
wait
in
to get
that,
to Jacob because that's just yet another
uh,
whoa.
we'll break the internet when we get to that, but
Yeah.
people will have to wait. We didn't. One thing I wanted to touch upon that we didn't last time was about how, when we read verses of like God speaking to Abram, to our modern ears and modern Christian ears, we just think, okay, whatever, that's normal, you know. But in the ancient world, that would not make any sense at all. And the reason is because the gods in the ancient world spoke to the priests. The
Hmm.
priest's entire life was dedicated to understanding the rituals, understanding the potions, the drugs, and the procedures in order to communicate with the gods. The gods didn't come down and talk to your local farmer or your local carpenter, right? If they needed to hear from the gods, they would have to go to a temple and talk to a priest or some sort of
Which is a
oracle.
giant problem for me.
Right. Right. That's the way the ancient world worked. And so the entire idea that if a god shows up and talks to someone directly, this is totally different than the way the ancient world operated, right? This is very,
Hmm.
very different. And if you're, like Abram, and you've got your, flocks of shepherds, you've got servants and slaves, and a community of the family and friends, and some god appears in some way. It doesn't really describe it in detail in these passages, but we get more detail later on. And says, "I'm going to be the God of you." This is a complete departure from what people are used to, because you had gods of communities. Every city had its own god. Every nation had gods. When cities merged together, their gods would sometimes merge, or they would fight, and one god would kill the other god. There was no gods of particular person, right? Or
Yeah.
and so this is a very, very um, unique situation that most modern readers don't really pick up on, and the ancient listeners would hear this and say, "Oh, this is something special. This is something totally out of the ordinary, right? For
Yeah,
somehow
because also
this God to show up."
pharaohs, kings were also intermediary in pagan times. So
Right,
they were kind of like the gods here,
right. So
supposedly.
yeah, they're right.
Self-proclaimed. Yeah.
So what we're seeing here is, instead of the plebes, the average folk, having to appeal to God through a higher authority, we have God coming down and appealing directly to a person, right? And this is what happens with the entire story of Christianity: is we have an inversion of the ancient world. The ancient world of being the people being essentially slaves to the gods and the great powers, and having to appeal to them for mercy. We have the God of all the gods coming down, coming directly to a person and saying, "You're going to lead my revolution in this world, and it's starting with you."
Yeah,
Um,
and I
so,
have some thoughts on that too because I think basically the way I see it, if I just completely zoom out in history, the way I see it is it was a very good way of controlling people by saying you can only think and do things through this sector, through this priest, through this establishment. And then what happened, where it really happened strongly, I would say, is with Jesus, when he just preached that God is within everyone and everyone can gain that connection to God. Here, that's happening perhaps too, but if you think about it, later in history, Abraham then has been turned into this forefather figure who was also special, right, in a sense. So I think some sectors have gone right back to the original thing, where you can only access God through us. Like if I think about Rabbinic Judaism, it's kind of like that. You're just basically not even supposed to read the book on your own. It's supposed to be through the lens of the rabbi. And then in Christianity, that has happened somewhat as well. It's like through the church, through the pastors. So many Christians have never read the book themselves on their own. But I think what was, let's say, Jesus trying to do to give that spiritual freedom to everyone got people reverted back to their old ways. And I think that freedom became only accessible to those who understood it.
Well, yeah, the story of the Old Testament is the repetition of the Jews going back to their old ways over and over and over again. God says, do A, B, and C, and the Jews do that for a while, and then they go off deep end, and then they suffer the consequences, and then God brings them back and says, okay, do A, B, and C, like I said, and they say, okay, we'll do it this time, and then they start to, and then they go off, and it's just repeated over and over again. A lot of more of your atheistic or non-religious scholars will make some archaeological discovery and say, hey, we found all these pagan gods with the ancient Jewish relics. This means they were worshiping other gods, and therefore your religion is false. And it's like, have you not read the Bible? Like, they keep worshiping other gods. That's the whole story in the Old Testament. They keep doing it. When God says stop worshiping other gods, and they keep reverting back to it.
And when you look at the history of how many messiahs they had, how many messiahs that just came, and granted, not all were accepted as messiahs. Jesus was a big one that they completely rejected. Well, I wouldn't say they completely rejected, because technically all of those Jews who became Christian, they became Christian. So they're no longer Jews, because Jewish is not a race, it's a religion.
Yeah, and in the Christian tradition, the longest Christian tradition, the Orthodox tradition, is that is the same church from the very beginning. Like, there wasn't a great conversion to Christianity. Christianity is the same religion from Genesis all the way through, right? You have more revelations of what God is, so there's no conversion that happens. What the conversion is when the Jews who didn't accept Jesus, they went their own way and went to Rabbinical Judaism, right? That's the church's. That's always been the church's position until modern day, Western evangelicals.
At some point they went from priesthood to rabbinic
right. Well,
ways.
And because the temple was destroyed, right? And they got dispersed by the Romans, and they had to figure out, what do we do now, right? We're not going to be Christians, right? We're not going to follow that path. So what do we do? And they Rabbinic Judaism developed that about.
Yeah, but then they were constantly expecting a Messiah in a military leadership format. So throughout history, you keep like Bar Kokhba, or how just so many revolts would take place because they thought this is the Messiah and this is the time, and then they would suffer the consequences. Some minor wins, short-lived, like the Kitos War, or was it Kitos War or Bar Kokhba? One of them gave them a temporary state for a moment, but then Romans crushed them, and then I would argue that's still happening today. They keep waiting for this Messiah, and anybody who appears to be exceptionally pro-Israel or pro their people, they just start thinking that's the next Messiah. So it's like Schneerson.
From the Christian perspective,
they're
going to be waiting for a very long time because the Messiah already came 2,000 years ago.
That's definitely the definitely the Christian perspective, for sure.
Right. But it's, that's what happens. And we see that, I don't want to dwell too much on it, but with Abram, this is a completely inversion of the ancient world. It's a direct communication with God to a non-priest. And the priesthood is later developed. And according to God's command. I mean, he creates the priesthood. We'll find out much later on when we get to like Leviticus. But it isn't it isn't an exclusive way eventually as some of the ancient
Okay.
world was. But I just wanted to bring that up because we didn't talk about that last time, about how
Yeah.
unique this story actually is. It's just completely different than um, other stories of the time.
Yeah, sometimes I edit the episodes and I look back and I'm like, oh my God, why did I not say this or that? Like, there's just so much I would want to say, but it's okay. In time, we'll get to things.
All right. So Abram, there, he's going to come back up from Egypt, and with Lot, who is his nephew, um, and we'll see what happens. Not a whole lot happens, but we'll go through 13 and then discuss it.
Okay.
So chapter 13. So Abram went up from Egypt, and he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold, some of it from Egypt.
Yeah.
And he journeyed on from Negeb as far as Bethel, which means house of God, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar uh, at the first. We can remember that from the previous chapters. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord, Yahweh. And Lot, who went up with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. It is not the whole land before you. Separate yourselves from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Sorry, spoilers. You didn't know what was coming. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled amongst the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord Yahweh. And the Lord Yahweh said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring. I will make your offspring as dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent, came and settled by the oak, or oaks, of Mamre, which we discussed previously, the silent oak, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord.
So that's Anthony's take of what the silent oak is. Honestly, it's one of those chapters that is just talking about settlement. I don't have too much to say. The only thing that's like strikes at me is obviously that now he was rich, like very rich. That's not little. He goes into Egypt, causes mayhem, pimps out his wife, and then comes out. And now he's extremely rich. That just, I can run parallels on that one. And
Mm.
then and then they journey and then they settle somewhere, and somehow it's just not enough. Like it's just not enough for both of them, so they have to go further. Questionable whether it's not enough or just greed for me. I wonder about that. I don't have much to say about this particular chapter. For all that land you see, I will give you, you and you to your offspring forever. So here it clearly says your offspring, doesn't say which one. An offspring is, I don't know what's the Hebrew word for it, but offspring I think is singular, right? Like basically both there's no offsprings, right?
Well, right. So, yeah, and my understanding is, let me look at how in the Orthodox Study Bible here, my understanding of that word is in the Hebrew, I cannot remember if it is a distinctive plural or it's indistinct. Same in the way, like the word seed. In a lot of translations, it'll say seed instead of offspring. And seed can be singular or plural, right? We
Yeah.
buy a bag of bird seed, not bird seeds,
Mm-hmm.
like deer or fish, similar thing. Um, Paul, St. Paul does in the New Testament refer to one of these passages. I don't remember if it's this one or another one where it is distinctly singular. And he says, he's talking about Jesus as the particular offspring to come from Abram.
That's
But
very
generally
funny.
speaking, yeah, generally speaking, in a lot of, because there's more verses where they talk about Abram's seed and how numerous it will be, is it's very clear that it's talking about a great multitude of people,
That's
which
really
it's,
funny because he's talking about Jesus. I'm not, yeah, at all thinking about Jesus. I'm thinking about the fact that Abraham ends up having a lot of offsprings, which, if you map it to who they were, they would include all the, you know, it would include Canaanites, Palestinians, Jordanians. It would include the kind of like the Arabic line, Lebanese, Syriacs, right? Because he gives birth to whatever. There is a kid
Ishmael,
that he ends
yeah,
up
Ishmael.
having, the firstborn, and then it goes into whoever, and then Jacob. But if offspring is, just offspring, not offsprings, or a particular offspring, which that's what it says right here, then they're
And this one's very
fighting
clear. It's talking about a
over.
great number of people because it's comparing it to the sands of the earth, right? The dirt, the dust. If you
Exactly.
count every single grain of sand, then that's how many people are going to come from this nation that I'm building through you, right?
Exactly, which makes today's fight over the land very silly, almost. Like, if you're going to ever bring up the Bible as if those are your lands, then the Bible kind of suggests those were many people's lands.
Well, yeah, and in that case in particular, I mean, the Christian idea is that the whole universe belongs to God. You don't own anything, and the last temptation that Satan gave to Christ was to offer him all the land, right? It was a temptation of land and kingdoms. I'll give you control over all of this land and all the kingdoms, right? And Christ said, "Get behind me." So when you give the entire universe to God, saying, "This is your property. I'm just here tending it for you, right, as your servant," then if everyone on earth thought that way, we wouldn't be having fights over land, you know?
Well, that's definitely true. And also, like, there is a contrast between Old Testament and New, obviously. That's why I personally think Christians should not adapt Old Testament at all. Just dump it. If you need a creation story, there's no shortage of books that have the creation story if you want to, write your own version. But it's because the Old Testament is extremely heavily, very wealth driven. Extremely, like, almost every step of the way somebody comes out wealthy, and it's about riches. It's very opposite of the New Testament, obviously, and
No,
what's
it's
important in life.
it's a story of, as we mentioned earlier, God saying do this, and they start doing it, and they fall, and then God brings them back, says no, you need to do it this way. They start doing it, and then they get rich, or they get lustful, or whatever sin it is,
But
they end
here's
up
the thing:
falling.
God keeps helping that. God
Right.
keeps helping that money worship, in a sense, like wealth worship,
Well,
in a sense. Because if you keep
he doesn't.
rewarding, how do you train a dog, right? You reward good behavior, you punish bad behavior. God keeps rewarding their bad behavior. So, which means
It
their
doesn't
God is in
reward.
favor of that.
It wouldn't be the bad behavior that's being rewarded. It's because every time they stray from God's commands, they end up usually getting taken over by other tribes, or there's catastrophes or plagues or problems, or snakes start biting everybody. And whenever they start following God, they tend to be doing better off. But then they stray again, and there are consequences to their sinning, right? And so, like the idea
Well,
of the Jews falling over and over and over again, and God still forgiving them, like that's the whole idea of God being a forgiving God. He's like, if you repent and come back to me, you're not going to suffer these consequences, but you have to turn and come back to me. And then they do it, but then they fall again because we're all human. And the Old Testament's a story about a bunch of faulty humans who, no matter how hard they try to do what's right in God's eyes, they keep screwing it up. And doing it in a terrible way. And that's basically the gist of the Old Testament, is that you can't be perfect. Even
Well,
if you
I guess I
try to
disagree
do what's right.
because right here, excuse me, I disagree because right here we have a story where Abraham went to Egypt on his own. He didn't have to. He does what he does, and then comes out with all this wealth while his wife was temporarily somebody else's wife. And then I don't see any Lord punishment. I see Lord rewarding him, saying, all this land's going to be yours. That is not a punishment. He didn't, like, I would like to see Abraham get punished over him pimping out his wife.
Well, yeah. Well, in my interpretation, is the punishment was him almost losing his wife, because he should never have gone to Egypt, and she had never had come up with some sort of scheme to protect himself. He should have stayed in Canaan where he was told to go, but he went to Egypt because he was scared. And the consequences, he almost lost his wife, and he almost lost the entire tribe because
But
he
he
tried to come up
didn't.
with a scheme instead of going
He
elsewhere.
didn't. He didn't lose any of
And
that. He
God saved him.
gained everything back plus a lot of wealth.
Hmm?
So outcomes matter. So he came
Yeah, but he
out
almost did.
scot-free
Right.
with wealth, and God said nothing to him. Like, yo,
Well,
why'd you stray away?
we're only chapter 13 here, but he
All
almost
right.
lost everything. Like, just with the Jews, they didn't all die. A lot of them died later on, right? But they aren't ever completely wiped out, right? They're still rescued at the end. Sometimes they nothing bad happens, but it almost happens. It's like a threat, in a way. But
I don't see the almost part. It was all willful trickery that took place, and he came out perfectly fine. And I have a feeling Abraham would not give a crap if anything happened to his wife, because there's nothing in the text that makes me think that he had a particular love for her, other than he thought she's pretty and he used that. He exploited her beauty for riches. So,
maybe, I
I
mean,
mean,
maybe he
that's
was
how I read it.
maybe at this point of the story, he's not a very good person.
No, he's, in my eyes, he's a horrendous person. But
I
yeah,
mean,
let's.
if you wanted to, yeah, if you wanted to argue that he's not a very good person, I mean, it's the way that God is instructing him and getting him to follow him. He's saying, "Hey, look, I'm going to create a great nation for you." Like he's saying, "Look what I'm going to do for you," right? And so, if you look at this as this is Abram's an ancient person who lived in an ancient world before the Christian ethic, and kind of like you said, if you train a dog or a toddler, you can only train them in particular ways. You can only get them to do something if you give them a reward. It's not till someone spiritually matures that they start doing good things automatically on their own. So if you're going to take that perspective, you can say, well, Abram's clearly a spiritually immature person, but God is slowly training him how to become a righteous person. So,
Well,
but
what I'm
first he has to
saying is
tell him,
that
hey, I'm going to do something for you and build you a great nation. And then as the story progresses, he becomes more and more righteous. But he still screws up later on because he ends up having Ishmael.
he doesn't exactly screw. Technically, Sarah, we'll get there. But the way I see it, what this tells me is forget about ancient times or whatever. Because if God is God, then it's not like he was a human who just was living in ancient times and then slowly learned a lot and then decided to change his heart and mind. God's supposed to be all knowing from the get go and not like need education to become something else, which means what this tells me is that this book's God is not the same God as the Christian God.
Who are you talking about is learning? I'm talking about Abram, not God.
No, I'm
Abram's
talking
learning,
about,
right? Yeah.
yes, you said this is ancient times.
Yeah. So
So
Abram is a man from an ancient world that thinks in ancient ways and has ancient cultures and ideas of morality. And Abram is learning and growing throughout the story, right? He starts off probably better. He starts off better than probably his neighbors, which is why God picks him. But he still ends up making a lot of mistakes. And with Ishmael later on, he's not supposed to sleep with one of his slaves. You know, he's supposed to wait for the miracle that God promises, and he sleeps with his servant because his wife says, "Hey, sleep with my servant," and instead of listening to God, he listens to his wife, right? And then they have Ishmael, which ends up leading to this war in the Middle East that we now suffer today, basically, you know?
Yeah, but I guess the way I see it is I'm not seeing God necessarily communicating with him at all that this was wrong, this was right. Like he's just letting him do things and get away
Sure.
with it, and he keeps rewarding the bad behavior, which means
Uh,
he's not really punishing the bad behavior. So, which means this is a very different God. This is a very different
at,
God
at,
than Jesus. Or
at this point in
Jesus,
the story,
Jesus is God, whatever.
yeah, at this point in the story, we don't have a lot of moral instruction from God yet. We just have direction, right? And we get some moral instruction later on, but just the way that the story is laid out, there's not a lot of moral instruction. And I think a lot of people would say that that's because it's kind of implicit in the listener. I mean, this is a story being told much later on. It even mentions Sodom and Gomorrah, saying, "Hey, by the way, this is but this is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah," because the listener already knows that story, right? So it's like the listener's already going to have an idea that there's probably some sort of morality that ends up being taught. But I don't want to go too far ahead
Yeah.
before we get to any of that. But I do want to. There are a couple things I want to say here. Is that there's an interesting repetition of the metaphysics between left and right, yin and yang, masculine, feminine, that the duality going on here as well that we see replayed again between Lot and Abram. Abram says, because they're in one land and there's not enough grass and like land for all of their flocks to be able to feed, and their tribes are fighting amongst each other. They say, "Hey, we're fighting amongst each other. Let's split," which is like a cell mitosis splitting into two. And we have essentially the parallel of Cain and Abel, right, happening here in a way, because Abram gives Lot the ability to choose wherever he wants to go. Lot looks around and he sees this beautiful land that looks like a garden, like the Garden of Eden, like Egypt. So he's kind of pulled in a way towards beauty. Something looks lushful. And so he goes over there, and it says he pitches his tent. And then Abram
Just
takes
squatter.
yeah, well, yeah, they're what's the word? Vagrants, almost. They just live in tents. But Abram gets the land of Canaan, and he builds an altar. And I think that's the key to this chapter, which is setting up what's coming up next, is that Lot goes into this beautiful land nearby where all the sinners are. Like they already know that there's plenty of horrible sinning and idol worshiping and human sacrificing and all sorts of terrible things happening in the beautiful part of the land. And Lot decides to go live, not in the city, he's not participating, but he's right at the border of it, and he pitches a tent. But Abram stays far away from the evil city, and he builds an altar. So we're having a clear dichotomy between someone who's willing to live adjacent to unrighteousness and someone who actually is righteous and trying to worship the God that's leading them. Right. So that's what's being set up in this chapter. That's basically the purpose of this chapter, is to set up that imagery of what's happening.
Sure. But Lot, I believe, gets saved or gets away. I don't think he gets destroyed with Sodom and Gomorrah, but we'll see. I don't remember fully.
We won't spoil it for the listener who has never read the next few chapters.
Okay, so let's go into chapter 14.
And just stop me wherever you want to. All right, chapter 14. Abram rescues Lot, or Lot's capture and rescue. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedor Laomer, king of Elam. I had someone recently said that reading the Old Testament feels like reading Lord of the Rings. You have, you have all of these interesting names. And honestly, that's a lot of the inspiration for Tolkien when he wrote his books.
Probably,
he took direct inspiration from Old Testament names.
Oh, I bet. But the Tidal, king of Goiim, stands out to me because I wonder if Goiim is the same Goiim that now is in Jewish lexicon. Goiim as in Goy, like Gentile.
It might be. That's a good question. Let me see. How is it translated here? In the Orthodox Study Bible, it's translated Tidal, king of nations. And
Tidal,
in
king
ESV,
of
it's
nations.
King of Goyim.
That's very interesting.
Do you have your Armenian Bible?
Yeah.
With you? How is that translated?
Ազգերի արքա թարգաղը. it does say King of Nations.
Hmm.
Targach. Targach probably is the title. Yeah. So it says Kings of Nations.
Interesting. Well, okay, that's probably actually is the root of what you typically hear as Goyim, because Goyim basically means just
Others.
nations, others, right? Other nations, other people that aren't the Hebrews or the Jews, right?
It
It just means
has
others,
become
peoples. Yeah.
derogatory, but it
Right.
meant that, yeah.
Yeah. So title King of Nations of Goyim. Good catch there. These kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. So that would be the Dead Sea, I'm assuming here.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Well, I'll come back to that. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Enim in Shavet Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. I hope everyone's like keeping a mental map of where all this is happening. You know,
Yeah, it is. It is obviously so far away from today's labels of these nations that it's really hard. But there is. It does say the country of Amalekites, which I have some interesting stuff I've been learning about that. But
The Alamakites, yes, yeah, they come up as an important other tribe here.
they come up a lot in many chapters.
And I want to bring up here. Let me finish this paragraph, and I'll come right back. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Alamakites, and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. We mentioned earlier had defeated the Rephaim, and this is verse 5, where the 14th year Chedor Lamer and the king who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim. Rephaim are giants. That is a giant clan. So this is so what this paragraph here is summarizing to the listener who already knows some of this history, because you can tell the way it's written. It's like it's talking to people who kind of already understand the history, but it's just giving a synopsis since it's rehashing some of this for the rest of the story. But we'll see later on the Rephaim are a return of a giant clan. A lot of these are giant clans actually. The Rephaim are a particular type of giants. They're not the same giants as we saw before the flood, right? Those giants, according to a lot of lore, are much, much larger, much, much more powerful, and live for a much longer time. These giants are less tall. They're still tall, because we'll end up finding that when we see Goliath later on, who is a giant and part of one of these giant clans. But they do return, because as we saw with Babylon, the people started practicing some of those ancient rituals that granted them secrets of reality and secrets of spirituality that gave them special powers, like how to give birth to giants. Then the
Okay.
kingdom of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goiim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now, the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of them fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country, up in the mountains. So the enemies took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, who was just happened to be camping out in that area, and he saw all this happening, and the sons of Abram's brother, who were dwelling in Sodom and his possessions, and went their way. So they basically captured him as a slave or a servant. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oak of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. As he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot, which is his nephew, with his possessions and the women and the people. So we'll stop there. So, long story short, Lot camps out in the pretty area. A giant war breaks out. Lot and everyone gets captured, and Abram has to go into that land to rescue them and bring them out. Sounds like a story we've heard before, and we're going to hear over and over again.
I think I will not talk about Alamex in this episode because I think in
We'll wait.
Exodus
Yeah.
and in many more, it becomes much more prominent. So yeah, I think it is interesting. It's just describing some ancient wars that probably we don't have in history, just because this is supposed to be 2000 BCE ish, right?
Right. About 2000 BC.
Yeah, but it says that the Salt Sea, which gives you a hint that it's the Dead Sea, so it's around there. Although, I guess I just have to trust that this translation points you to that direction. That must be true. Սրանք բոլորը հավաքվեցին Աղի ձորում, որ Աղի ծովն է. Okay, it does say Salt Sea.
So, yeah, that's the understanding is that is the Dead Sea. It's not the ocean.
I should keep
right?
this
It's
here.
the Dead Sea. You probably should, yeah. So there's something I want to talk about here, and I think this will make this episode worth listening to for the viewer. And we'll finish the rest of the chapter here later. But I do want to mention why the promised land, because this land has already been promised to Abram. This is a special land. Why did he choose this particular spot?
Which
Of all the
seems like there's
places-
a lot of people here already. So
Yeah, there's already a lot of people there. There's plenty of open land everywhere. The world's a big place. What is special about this particular land? Abram could have camped out near any other town, or could have gone out into the desert somewhere else, or found some other lush territory. It's not like every lush place on the planet is full of people. The planet only probably has a few million people on it total, right? So at this point in time. And the hint, and this is my interpretation, because I like to look at things I like to look for patterns in metaphysics. There's a very unique geography in the Promised Land that doesn't exist anywhere else, and that is the two seas, Galilee and the Dead Sea, connected by the River of Jordan. You have the Sea of Galilee in the north, and you have a Dead Sea in the south, and you have this river that connects the two of them. And right there on the planet Earth, you have a perfect representation of the masculine and the feminine, of yin and yang, of heaven and earth being connected by a stream. Even to the point where you have the seventh chakra and the first chakra at the bottom, all connected by the spinal column. And this is a physical manifestation, representation of a metaphysical principle that's actually here on Earth. Now, I know that sounds kind of ridiculous the way I'm saying it, but if you step back and think about it for a moment, we have the Sea of Galilee up at the north, which would be heaven up above, full of fish and life. That's where everyone builds their towns around, and they live there. That's where Jesus ends up, sailing across multiple times. He walks on the water on that sea. Jesus walks on the water in the waters of heaven. All the way down, you have the Dead Sea. Not a single thing is alive there. Everything is dead. There's not a single fish. Nothing can drink that water. It is literally death itself. And so you have heaven and a stream of life that slowly goes down until it disintegrates into pure death. And you cannot have a more perfect representation of a metaphysical principle than that itself. And the fact that that actually exists on this planet somewhere is a miracle in my mind. It's absolutely mind-blowing that there is some place like that on the planet Earth. And to build on top of that, for this particular chapter, a giant battle happens where a bunch of people die, a bunch of sinful people are killing each other. Basically, hell on earth is happening. And where is it happening? Right around the dead damn sea, right in hell, right? So Lot ends up camping near hell, which is what the story is saying. He decides he's going to go camp basically near hell. And a war breaks out. And then what does Abram do? They get taken captive in this metaphysical representation of hell on earth. And Abram goes into hell and rescues Lot and his entire family and pulls him out of there. And that is the story of Jesus dying, entering Hades, and resurrecting with the people. Like, mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing to me.
Well, My response to all of that is highly cynical. Not at all, not at all there. What are the thoughts going through my head are the fact that everybody gets attached to their lands. It's just something we do as humans, right? Like as an Armenian, I have certain connection to Armenian lands, and oftentimes it just because it's your home. And there is a word in Armenian called ojach, which is a little bit, it's more than a home. It's like almost carries remnants of your DNA, basically. And I think just the same way for Jews or for Arabs or for anybody, they are attached to their home. So just if that home happens to be a desert, you're going to still be attached to that desert because that's what you're used to, and that's what you love. And then when you said Jesus walked on this water, I was like, if this is the sea he walked on, then it all makes sense because salt makes you like, have you
No,
been
no,
to
he
Dead
walked on the Sea
Sea?
of Galilee. He walked on the one at north, not the Dead Sea. Yeah, yeah. No,
So
yeah.
I
If you
can
swim
see
in the
how
Dead
one can
Sea,
walk
you
on Dead
float.
Sea.
Yeah, it's easy to float in the Dead Sea because there's so much water or salt in there.
Salt.
The buoyancy is ridiculous. But yeah, it'd still be impressive if Jesus walked on that water, but not as impressive as Galilee, where it's fresh water and there's fish there and everything.
Yeah. Yeah, fresh water is what would be impressive. The Dead Sea, you probably give yourself big enough shoes.
Probably like
You might just
snowshoes,
float.
but they're water shoes. Just
Little boats, boat
kind of like a
shoes.
little one of those water spiders that zips around on top of it. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, it's basically like the way it sounds to me is obviously I will probably never in my life get to a point where I think that this is like God God aided to write this book. Rather, it's just humans wrote the book, humans wrote the story. Even if the Armenian thing literally says Astvat Ashunch, which means the breath of God. I don't particularly buy that because people wrote it, and if people wrote it, then people continuously try to connect them with certain home, and hence that's what I see when I read these things.
Well, it's a very Western idea that God basically, grabbed the scribes' hands and like wrote it for them. I mean, and even in the Orthodox tradition and Catholic and Eastern traditions, Scripture is seen as God inspired, but it's not. It's a different way of looking at it than the Protestant idea that God, you know, typed every single word out himself. Which is why there's a lot more freedom and flexibility for things that aren't particularly super accurate or things that seem to semi contradict each other. There's more flexibility because in the older traditions, it's seen as inspired by God, but you don't have to hold it so tightly that if there's one, you can't have even one slightly maybe sort of wrong thing possible at all. It all has to be perfect. Like that, it's never been looked at that way until modern times. Because there's so many different translations. There's so many different ancient documents. There's so many different versions you can come with, and even in the ancient Hebrew writings, we don't have the dot and tittles. We don't have the vowels, even in the oldest documents. So you have to go by some sort of tradition to decide what the words are actually saying.
Well, in my other channel, now that I'm talking about the Jewish topic and there's a lot of people commenting, the religious ones sound like they believe this was God's word, just like Islam, who believes that the Quran is basically God's word. It hasn't been altered.
Right.
Basically,
And it's
the
very
radicals
common for people
believe.
to still look at it that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And in the Quran, I guess the best way I can try to help people see the difference is that Muslims see the Quran the way that Christians see Jesus, right? Jesus is the physical manifestation of God on earth, right? But in Islam, the Quran is the physical manifestation of God on earth, right? The Quran is God on earth. And that's the way Muslims see Quran, and Christians see Christ as God on earth. And what happens is that a lot of Christians start to look at the Bible and they're like, oh, that's God on earth too, right? They start to look at the Bible the way that Muslims look at the Quran. And that's not the tradition that Christians have. Christians have always seen it as God inspired, but they haven't seen it as equivalent to Christ himself, right? Which is a problem that happens because Christ is the Word of God. And then there became this tradition of referring to the Bible as the Word of God, which is a very modern development, right? The Word of God is Christ himself. The Bible are words. Much of them came from God. Not all of them came from God. Some are just
The Bible
dictations
is
from
more
people.
like confirming that Jesus was here and he was God, rather than yeah.
Yeah, that's one way of saying it, and I don't want to say anything that's way off from the proper, And like I said, I don't speak on behalf of any denomination at all. This is my own understanding from where I come from.
Oh
But
yeah.
yeah, it's the Bible is seen as a record that helps prove or shows evidence to that Christ is God,
Yeah.
from the Genesis all the way through Revelations.
Yeah, exactly. But let's finish this chapter because we're getting
Yeah.
long. All right. Abraham
All
blessed.
right. Melchizedek. That's how you say it. After
Melchizedek.
his return, yeah, Melchizedek. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley, and Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Important here. He was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything, and the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, not your Game Boy, not your Hot Pockets, I'm kidding, lest that you should say that I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share."
All right. The first time they show Abraham maybe being somewhat noble.
Hey, he's growing. He's becoming a better man. You know?
Okay, so basically he goes against the kings and they try to bribe him and he says no. That's the moral of the story here.
Kind of, in a way.
Bribe him and
In a
take
way.
his man for slaves or something maybe, or yeah, what's your take on it? I'm too fasted. Third day. I'm
Too
like
fasted.
yeah.
I know we're talking about, bread and wine. Well, the first thing I want to bring up, so Melchizedek, and we'll learn this later, and I don't want to go into all the detail about this, but
Yeah, we can keep it short because we're inching up to an hour.
So in the Orthodox tradition, Christ's priesthood is called the Order of Melchizedek. So, but there's a lot more to it that we'll get into later. But you'll notice here Melchizedek is a priest of the God Most High. So we're talking about the same God that talks to Abram, and it's important to note that before he blesses him, what does he bring him? Bread and wine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's an obvious symbol that's going to become very important
In
later
liturgy.
on. So, right, this is the liturgy, the Eucharist. Bread and wine. He brings out bread and wine, which, to be fair, is the common, food and drink of the time.
Yeah.
But it's mentioned very particularly here, bread and wine, and then this is a blessing, right? And that is what happens at every single church, Orthodox or Catholic church, every Sunday, is bread and wine is brought out, and you will receive a blessing through that. So that's the most important part of this sector. If you don't see Christ as God, and you don't see the Eucharist as an important part of this story, then this means nothing. But if you do see it, which is why Christians say you need to read the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus, and then everything starts to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Once you read the Old Testament through the lens of Christ, you see things that non-Christians would miss. And something like the bread and wine here being presented and then giving a blessing, that is a clear foreshadowing of what's to come 2,000 years later.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It's interesting. It's interesting. But we're right at right below an hour. I think this is a good place to end this chapter unless you have any last words.
Last words forever.
Subscribe.
Subscribe, like,
Share.
follow, share, all those things. Um, if you're not following or like my metaphysics stuff, maybe we'll do an episode where I dive more into the basics of metaphysics to help people follow that. But the beginning is light and dark, duality. Start with there, and then after that's Trinity. But no, this is an interesting little segment of the Bible, and I think we covered a few reasons why I find it fascinating, particularly the miracle, in my opinion, that the basics of duality is manifested on the planet Earth itself and was the place that was chosen to be called the Promised Land.
All right.